Although not as well known today, Soviet film greatly influenced film history both in the Eastern Bloc and the West, and it all began with Alexander Shiryaev. Originally a ballet dancer acting as a lead in a variety of performances at the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg, Shiryaev began experimenting with stop motion film in 1906, recreating ballets from his home. These films eventually reached a wider audience and began to influence others to attempt similar projects. Independently from Sharyov, another pioneer of film began working at the same time, Ladislaus Alexandrovich Staryevich, a biologist from St. Petersburg who began to use embalmed insects to create stop motion films about the lives and interactions of several creatures. These so-called cockroach shorts became well renowned within the cinema scene of early Russia, even earning Staryevich an award personally given to him by Tsar Nicholas II. Staryevich continued to create film until the revolution. With Staryevich's flight from the country, the Russian animation scene remained stagnant for many years. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or better known as Vladimir Lenin, returned to Russia in 1917 during the October Revolution. He was one of the first to recognize the importance of film. For Lenin's government and the early USSR, film was of the utmost importance. So much so that the entire industry was nationalized in 1919 and would remain so for many, many decades. Soviet filmmakers, just as Western filmmakers, used folklore and fairy tales for both entertainment and propaganda. It was under Stalin, however, that animation once again became a larger part of the Soviet cinema scene, with the release of Interplanetary Revolution in 1924. During this time period, a variety of fairy tales were adapted to screen both in film and in animation. This era saw the introduction of agitprop, communist propaganda influences in the animation, which would stick with the art style for many years. Around this time, the first Russian animated fairy tale was created in 1933 by the married Mikhail and Vera Chikanovskaya, the tale of the priest and the workman Bulda. An operatic satirization of Alexander Pushkin's fairy tale of the same name. Alexander Tushko, another pioneer in stop-motion animation, began teaching at Mosfilm during this time, creating such works as The Tale of the Fisherman and the Fish, among many other classic folk tales in the style of stop-motion. Soyuzmultfilm, a film company founded during this time and invited Disney's animators in 1936 to teach students at the company in the Golden Age Disney art style, a style which heavily influenced Soviet cartoons for the next several decades. These collaborations between Soviet and Disney animators heavily inspired both the art styles and stories which they told. One such story would be The Golden Key, which was inspired heavily by Disney's Pinocchio. However, as the Second World War came to Soviet territory, a great deal of film, especially the cartoons, were halted.
St. Petersburg, or Leningrad at the time, was the hub of all Soviet animation and fell into a desperate siege for almost the entirety of Soviet participation in the war. During this time, many films were destroyed in the bombings and fires, such as The Tale of the Priest and the Workman Balda, which was the first Soviet fairy tale animation. Just as with the West, the propaganda-influenced film titled The Humpback Horse, which was another fairy tale film, for example, was rife with anti-imperialist messages targeted at the general audience. Soy's multi-film began to take a strange hold over Soviet animation following the war as the only company still able to create films to the same standard as prior to the war. They continued during this time to collaborate with Disney and even influence Disney animators for a time leading up to the 1950s and the Red Scare. It was during the period after the war that Soviet animation began to be targeted towards children to teach them moral values. For this, a great deal of folklore and fairy tales were utilized. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, a great deal of classic tales were adapted for this purpose, including The Snow Queen, Ruslan and Ludmila, and The Tale of Tsar Sultan. With the end of the Soviet Union, filmmaking became a privately owned business, with children still being the main audience. In the 1980s, 150 million people had television and watched the evening news, which was followed by a children's program called Spokojne noci, meaning Good Night, Little One. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Soviet-themed ideas were still present. For example, the popular international animated series Masha and the Bear, which premiered in 2009, and it had so many views worldwide, primarily children as their audience, as well as the character Chiburashka, who was a Soviet symbol who appeared as the Russian Olympics mascot from 2004 to 2010. In the end, Soviet animation and films were seen as a source of moral values that promoted the foundations of the USSR and used traditional elements of folklore, with impacts far-reaching in both the East and the West. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our presentation.